Hey everyone, tonight we're entering a realm where winter doesn't merely show up, it conquers. Imagine standing in a cramped passageway somewhere in East London. The year is 1860-something, and the chill is already working its way through your shoes. The stone pavement shimmers with a delicate coating of ice. Overhead clotheslines droop between structures so tightly packed that you could extend your arm and brush both walls simultaneously. Not far off, an infant wails. The atmosphere carries the scent of burning coal and something fouler, something distinctly human and musty and unavoidable. This is the slum district. This is what hundreds of thousands call home. And tonight the mercury is falling. You likely wouldn't make it through this? Not truly. Not without modern heating systems, not without your padded winter gear, not without the convenience of ordering warm meals from your device. The Victorians living here possessed none of those things. What they possessed was one another, a relentless determination to reach daybreak and a familiar understanding of freezing temperatures that most of us can never grasp. So before you settle in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. And share with me, where are you tuning in from? What hour is it in your location right now? I'm always excited to read your comments. Now, lower the lights. Let your breath become steady. And picture yourself entering the icy core of Victorian London. The initial thing that strikes you is the sound, or more precisely, the peculiar mixture of it. There's the faraway thunder of wagon wheels on a major street, the cutting yelp of a hound somewhere in the labyrinth of passages, and underneath everything, the quiet hum of too many souls crammed into too confined an area. You're positioned in what the Victorians labelled a rookery, a slum so packed, so unruly, that even law enforcement thought twice about venturing in once darkness fell. The term derives from the dwelling patterns of rooks, those dark birds that cluster together in massive, noisy groups. The parallel is fitting. Here, people nest in tiers, piled upon one another, wedged into every possible space. The structures tilt toward each other like weary elderly folks exchanging whispers. Some were constructed 100 years back for individual households. Now each chamber houses its own family, occasionally two. The partitions are flimsy. You can detect disputes, lullabies, and fits of coughing through the surface. Glass panes are fractured or completely absent, plugged with newsprint or worn fabric to block out the harshest of the draft. It doesn't function particularly well. The freeze penetrates anyway, threading through openings like an uninvited visitor who won't depart. Here's something researchers have recorded. By the middle of the 19th century, particular sections of London had crowding levels that matched anything we witness in contemporary megacities. In the infamous St Giles Rookery, certain calculations indicate there were close to 700 individuals per acre. For context, that's approximately the identical concentration as the most congested areas of Mumbai presently, except minus contemporary sewage systems, minus electric power, and minus any construction standards worth noting. You weren't simply freezing in a Victorian slum. You were freezing while squeezed against unknown people, freezing while inhaling their breath, freezing while stepping around their youngsters in the corridor. You venture further into the rookery and the odour grows stronger. It's an intricate mixture, if we're being charitable. Burning coal is the dominant note, bitter and recognisable. Below that, there's the organic stench of unwashed bodies and moist wool because nothing ever completely dries in this place. And beneath all of it, there's the unmistakable aroma of human excrement. The outdoor latrines are utilised by countless families, and during winter, nobody desires to make that bitter journey more often than absolutely required. Chamber pots get dumped from windows. The drainage channels do what they're able. It falls short. Here's an interesting fact researchers enjoy pointing out. Certain slum property owners genuinely favoured winter because frozen waste didn't reek as intensely. The cold functioned as a type of grim air freshener. Come springtime, naturally, the complete nightmare would emerge. but that represented a concern for subsequent landlords. Victorian slum reasoning was frequently precisely this short-sighted. You locate a doorway and enter inside. The structure moans around you, wood and brick adjusting in the freeze. The steps are tight and shadowy, each one polished smooth by countless feet. You ascend past the ground level, where you can detect a household quarrelling about finances. Past the level above, where somebody is humming a church song in a delicate, wavering tone. And up to the level beyond that, where a door hangs partially ajar. Within, you discover a solitary chamber, roughly 12 feet by 10. A modest hearth sits along one partition, but there's no blaze going, just some frigid cinders and the ghost of warmth. A lady sits on a three-legged seat near the glass, repairing something by the dull illumination. 3 youngsters are clustered together on a hay-filled sleeping pad in the corner, distributing a solitary cover. The partitions are marked with moisture. The overhead surface droops, and yet somebody has attached a modest portrait of the Queen over the fireplace, a tiny fragment of ambition in this domain of cold. The lady glances up at you. Her expression is creased beyond her age, her palms crimson and coarse. She doesn't appear startled by your arrival. In the rookeries, unknown people drift through perpetually. Renters, kin, frantic individuals seeking a space to lease. Solitude is an indulgence. Nobody present can pay for it. There's ongoing debate among researchers about how the Victorian impoverished genuinely viewed their personal circumstances. Certain academics contend that because such destitution was so common, inhabitants didn't encounter it as extraordinary misery. It was merely existence. Others respond that period records, especially from labouring class authors and advocates who had emerged from slum origins, display profound consciousness of unfairness and difficulty. The impoverished understood they were impoverished. They simply didn't invariably have the language or the platform to express it. You position yourself onto a timber box near the vacant fireplace. The frieze emanates from the surface, rising up through the bottoms of your footwear. Strange thing about frieze. It's not merely a measurement, it's an entity. It envelops you, bears down on you, requires your perpetual focus. You cannot disregard it the manner you might disregard a slight headache or a faint appetite. Frieze demands to be experienced. Beyond, the illumination is already diminishing. Winter afternoons in London are brief, scarcely 8 hours of greyish daylight before the blackness consumes everything once more. The lady places down her repair work and shifts toward the hearth, though she doesn't ignite a blaze, not presently. Coal requires funds, and funds are calculated in existence here. She'll delay until the youngsters are genuinely trembling before she combusts a solitary valuable chunk. This is the pattern of winter in the Victorian slums, not spectacular frozen fatalities in snowdrifts, but a gradual crushing bargaining with frieze that never entirely concludes. The lady observes you examining the partitions. She nearly grins, a tired, recognizing look that indicates she's witnessed that response previously. Guests from superior districts invariably observe the partitions initially. They cannot resist it. Where you originate from, partitions are substantial things, obstacles between interior and exterior, between warmth and freeze. Here partitions are closer to recommendations. You extend and contact the exterior closest to you. It's frigid, naturally, but also somewhat moist. Your digits withdraw with a slight film. The surface is split in countless locations, and in one section near the overhead, it's collapsed away completely, exposing the bare framework underneath, narrow strips of timber that resemble revealed bones. Through the openings you can sense the slightest whisper of external atmosphere. The structure is inhaling, and its inhalation is winter. These buildings were never intended to contain this quantity of individuals. The majority of them began existence as humble individual family residences in the 17th or 18th century. Constructed for traders or trained craftsmen, the assembly was sufficient for its initial function. Wood skeletons, brick exteriors, surface interiors. Nothing elaborate but functional. Then the populace of London detonated between 1800 and 1850. The metropolis nearly tripled in magnitude, expanding from approximately 1 million individuals to almost 2.5 million. The residences didn't expand, they merely occupied. Property owners realised they could generate far greater revenue by splitting. A 4-chamber residence became 4 individual chamber dwellings. Then somebody understood you could accommodate renters into the basement. Then somebody else constructed a makeshift addition in the rear yard. Before extended, structures intended for 6 individuals were containing 60. The partitions that had been sufficient for a modest household now had to withstand the dampness, the warmth, the absolute biological production of countless bodies compressed together. They couldn't manage. They began to decay. You glance up at the overhead and there it is, a widening mark of brown and green, the revealing indication of moisture harm. When precipitation falls, it drips. When frozen precipitation falls, it melts and drips. The lady has arranged the youngster's sleeping pad deliberately to evade the harshest drip locations. A geography of evasion she's committed to memory through extended practice in winter that moisture solidifies before it can completely penetrate. Which sounds like a benefit until you comprehend it signifies the ice is developing inside the partitions themselves, enlarging, splitting, making everything worse for following year. Here's a conventional historical reality that structure examiners of the period recorded thoroughly. Numerous slum buildings had no moisture barrier whatsoever. A moisture barrier is that coating of waterproof substance near the foundation of a partition that blocks dampness from ascending up from the earth. Minus it, moisture draws upward through the brick and rock, drenching everything. Certain examiner documents from the 1840s characterize partitions so saturated that fungus was sprouting on interior exteriors. Envision that, mushrooms growing in your sleeping chamber. It's almost remarkable in a terrible type of manner. The glass panes are another narrative completely. You rotate to scrutinise the one closest the lady's seat. It's a modest thing, roughly 2 feet square, with a timber border that's twisted and expanded from years of dampness. The glass, what persists of it, is delicate and distorted, the traditional variety that warps everything you observe through it. But completely half the section is absent, substituted by a fragment of brown newsprint that's been adhered over the opening. The newsprint trembles somewhat with each burst of draught. Beyond, it's approximately as productive as you'd anticipate. Glass was costly. Substituting a shattered pane might require a shilling or greater, which doesn't sound like considerable until you comprehend that a worker's household might exist on 12 shillings a week. Expending close to 10% of your revenue on a glass pane when that currency could purchase bread or coal was merely not a computation that made logic. So individuals improvised. Newsprint was typical. Worn fabric was favoured. Certain households plugged the openings with hay or even clay. Here's an interesting fact researchers enjoy pointing out. In certain of the most terrible slums, property owners would demand additional payment for chambers with intact glass panes, regarding functional glass as an indulgence feature rather than a fundamental requirement. The hearth, though, that's the centre of everything. You direct your focus to the modest fireplace along the distant partition. It's a humble construction, darkened with generations of application, the stonework deteriorating at the boundaries. Overhead it, a tight chimney vanishes into the overhead shared with the chambers overhead and underneath. This is the sole origin of warmth for the complete chamber. In principle, it should supply warmth for the lady, her 3 youngsters, and however numerous renters might be leasing corner area on any particular night. In reality, it supplies the recollection of warmth, the concept of warmth, a modest, wavering expectation that never entirely fulfills on its guarantee. The difficulty is mechanics, truly. Warmth ascends in a chamber with a 12-foot overhead and openings in every partition. Whatever warmth the blaze generates shoots directly up and out. The surface remains frigid, the sections remain frigid. The sole manner to genuinely sense warm is to position so proximate to the flames that you risk igniting your garments on blaze, which occurred with disturbing consistency. Burns were among the most typical injuries in Victorian slums, especially among youngsters and the aged who collapsed asleep too proximate to the fireplace. There's ongoing debate among researchers about whether slum fireplaces were intentionally constructed to be wasteful or merely became that manner through disregard. Certain investigators contend that property owners deliberately evaded chimney maintenance because functional chimneys pulled superior and consequently burned more coal, which was occasionally incorporated in payment. Others propose it was absolute apathy. These buildings generated revenue irrespective of state, so why expend currency sustaining them? The outcome was the identical regardless. Chimneys that smoked pulled inadequately and discharged warmth like filters. You observe the lady deliberately position 3 modest chunks of coal in the fireplace. She manages them like valuable gems, arranging each one for greatest impact. Then she incorporates a portion of what resembles powder and fragments swept from the surface. Coal dust, the grainy residue that gathers at the foundation of the coal container. It combusts inadequately, but it combusts, and nothing is squandered here. She ignites a flame stick, and for an instant the chamber occupies with the cutting scent of sulphur. Then the coal ignites unwillingly, and a modest flame begins to develop. The youngsters shift on their sleeping pad, attracted by impulse toward the guarantee of warmth. The eldest, a young female of roughly 8, envelops the cover more securely around her younger brothers and sisters, and shuffles toward the blaze on her knees, pulling them with her. They shift like a solitary creature, a modest bundle of existence clustered against the frieze. And you comprehend, observing them, that this blaze will require to endure all night. Those 3 chunks of coal, that portion of powder, this is it. This is the warmth they've been distributed by destitution, by situation, by a metropolis that scarcely recognizes their presence. The frieze bears in from every path, patient and perpetual. The blaze crackles gently, and you discover yourself tilting towards it without considering. It's a pathetic thing, truly, greater glow than inferno, greater expectation than warmth. But it's mesmerizing, all the identical. Blaze has that impact on people. We've been gazing into flames for 100,000 years, and something profound in our consciousness still reacts to that moving illumination with a type of fundamental appreciation. Warmth, protection, existence. The Victorians grasped this connection more closely than we ever will. Coal was everything here. Not currency, not nourishment, not even protection. Coal. Because minus coal, the currency signified nothing. The nourishment couldn't be prepared, and the protection was merely a frigid container gradually destroying you. The system of the slums operated on coal the manner contemporary systems operate on petroleum. It was the initial thing you considered when you awakened, and the final thing you computed before you rested. Do we possess adequate? Can we make it endure? What occurs if we exhaust? You observe the lady as she positions back onto her seat, her gaze never entirely abandoning the modest blaze. She's doing mathematics in her consciousness. You can determine the mental computations of destitution are perpetual and draining. 100 weight of coal, that's 112 pounds, might require somewhere between 1 shilling and 1 shilling 6pence, depending on the period, the provider, and how frantic you appeared when you requested. But nobody in the rookeries purchased coal by the 100 weight. That demanded currency in advance, containment area, and the type of preparation that destitution doesn't permit. Here, individuals purchased coal by the container, by the portion, by the solitary chunk, if that's all they could pay for. The modest coal merchants understood this naturally, and they modified their costs correspondingly. Purchasing in tiny quantities signified compensating greater per unit, a harsh mathematics that penalized the impoverished for being impoverished. Researchers have recorded this occurrence thoroughly. A household acquiring coal in modest daily quantities might compensate twice as considerable over a winter as a middle-class residence purchasing in volume. It's the identical principle that still functions presently. Indeed, being impoverished is costly. It invariably has been. Here's an interesting fact that appears in multiple period records. Certain slum households maintained their coal in sleeping arrangements with them, not adjacent to the sleeping arrangement, in it, beneath the covers pressed against their bodies. The logic was sensible, if grim. Coal abandoned in a shared corridor would be taken. Coal maintained in a section of the chamber might entice a frantic renter. But coal placed into your resting area, warmed by your personal body warmth, was protected. You'd awaken with dark powder on your flesh and in your bedding, but you'd awaken with combustible. The exchange made logic. The ladies' youngsters have positioned themselves around the blaze in a rehearsed configuration. The smallest, a young male of roughly 4, positions closest to the flames, his expression orange in the wavering illumination. The middle youngster, another young male, arranges himself merely behind, proximate adequate to capture some warmth, but prepared to extract his sibling back if he drifts too proximate. The eldest young female remains somewhat separate, her body angled to obstruct the current from the glass pane. They've completed this previously. They've completed this every night of their brief existences. You request the lady, in that peculiar, silent manner of dreams, how extended the blaze will endure. She raises her shoulders. 4 hours, possibly 5. Following that, they'll envelop themselves in everything they possess and delay for daybreak. The youngsters are accustomed to it. Everyone here is accustomed to it. Freeze is not a crisis in the rookeries. It's a period, a state, a reality of presence as dependable as gravity. But what occurs when the coal exhausts completely? What occurs when there's no currency, no extension, no charitable neighbour with a surplus chunk to distribute? You already comprehend the response because you've witnessed the chamber. Your gaze drifts to the section where a timber seat sits, absent one of its supports. The remaining 3 supports are fractured at the conclusions, obviously snapped rather than cut. That seat has already contributed part of itself to the blaze. Shortly it will contribute the remainder. Combusting furniture was typical. Combusting surface boards was not unprecedented. Certain households stripped the timber railings from communal steps, which generated endless disputes with neighbours and property owners. Here's something that sounds like grim humour but was recorded in numerous examiner documents. Certain occupants combusted their personal doors, then protested to property owners about the protection danger of possessing no door. The property owners, expectedly, were not compassionate. But when the selection is between solidifying tonight and concerning about robbery tomorrow, tonight invariably prevails. There's ongoing debate among researchers about how slum inhabitants made warming choices during the most terrible freeze periods. Certain investigators propose that community systems played a vital function. Households would combine resources, distribute blazes, and alternate whose chambers functioned as the shared warming area. Others contend that desperation made individuals more isolated, not less, with households stockpiling whatever combustible they possessed against uncertain tomorrows. The reality likely varied from passage to passage, household to household, depending on connections constructed up over years of distributed difficulty. You detect footfalls on the steps beyond, weighted and gradual. An instant later, a male materializes in the doorway. The lady's spouse, you presume, though he could merely as readily be a sibling, a renter, a unknown person leasing surface area for the night. He is transporting a modest container, which he positions down near the fireplace with visible, comfort. Coal, roughly 5 or 6 chunks, scarcely adequate to occupy your joined palms. But the lady's expression alters. Not pleasure precisely, but something proximate to it. Expectation, possibly, the understanding that tomorrow will not commence in complete desperation. The male's palms are dark with coal powder, and you observe that his finger ends are split and hemorrhaging. He's been to the coal depot then, sorting through the mounds for dropped fragments. Or roughly he's been along the railway tracks, where coal occasionally tumbles from cargo vehicles. This is labelled coal gathering or cinder seeking, and it's one of the numerous marginal systems that maintained slum existence. Youngsters completed it too, rivaling with adults for the fragments that maintained households alive. The scent of coal is powerful now, that characteristic mineral cutting mixing with the smoke already in the chamber. There's something almost reassuring about it if you permit yourself to ease into the history. Coal signified existence. Coal signified another night endured. The Victorians who inhaled this atmosphere didn't consider about respiratory illness or contamination measurements. They considered about warmth, immediate and required, and they were appreciative for every sooty inhalation. The male positions onto the surface near his youngsters, and the lady passes him a vessel of something. Leaf beverage, roughly, though it's probable greater moisture than vegetation. He envelops his palms around it, permitting the modest warmth to penetrate into his harmed digits. Nobody communicates. The blaze pops and arranges beyond. The draught picks up, shaking that newsprint-covered glass pane. This is prosperity in the rookeries, a portion of coal, a vessel of diluted leaf beverage, a household still alive at nightfall. It doesn't resemble considerable, but then once more, existence never does. The blaze illumination captures something suspended on a spike near the door, an outer garment, or what used to be an outer garment. It's difficult to determine in the dull illumination. The material is so deteriorated, so mended, so covered with maintenance upon maintenance, that it's become a type of historical documentation. You can witness where the initial wool surrendered to cotton mends, where those cotton mends were strengthened with what resembles sacking substance, where the whole thing has been sewn and resewn until the garment is greater thread than fabric. And yet it suspends there with a type of pride. This outer garment has witnessed things. This outer garment has endured. You're abruptly conscious of your personal clothing in a manner you weren't previously. Whatever you wore into this dream senses delicate and insufficient. The frieze is operating its manner through the coverings, locating the openings at your neck, your wrist ends, the modest of your back where your shirt has emerged untucked. You grasp now in a physical manner that clothing in the Victorian slums wasn't style, it wasn't even ease, it was construction, a transportable protection you constructed around your body and sustained with the identical desperation you'd sustain a covering. The lady witnesses you glancing at the outer garment and acknowledges. It belongs to her spouse, she clarifies in that wordless manner of dreams. He wears it to labour, which signifies he wears it for 14 hours a afternoon, 6 afternoons a week. It's the most precious thing the household possesses, worth greater than the furniture, worth greater than the sleeping pad, worth greater than everything in this chamber combined, except the youngsters themselves. Minus that outer garment, he couldn't labour. Minus labour, there would be no coal, no payment, no nourishment. The outer garment isn't clothing, it's existence, foundation. Here's a conventional historical reality that fabric researchers have recorded completely. Wool was the material of the impoverished, not because it was inexpensive, but because it was lasting and maintained some protecting characteristics, even when saturated. And everything in the slums was saturated. The moisture ascended from the surfaces, penetrated through the partitions, descended from dripping overheads, and gathered on every exterior. Cotton, which was becoming progressively affordable thanks to industrial manufacturing, Forfeited almost all its warmth when moist, wool maintained operating grudgingly even when it weighed twice as considerable from absorbed dampness. The scent was terrible. Saturated wool has that characteristic lanolin stench that adheres to everything, but the option was solidifying. You observe the youngsters in their cluster near the blaze and observe how they're attired. Coverings upon coverings, none of them entirely accommodating. The eldest young female wears what materializes to be a lady's blouse, reduced down and re-sewn to approximate her magnitude. Over that, a knitted vest with openings at both elbows. Over that, a wrap that might once have been crimson but has diminished to a muddy brown. The young males are similarly wrapped, their modest bodies vanishing into adult garments that have been collapsed, secured and bound into something wearable. Nothing corresponds. Everything functions a function. Previously owned clothing was the standard here, not the exception. The impoverished rarely purchased fresh garments they couldn't pay for, and honestly, fresh garments would have indicated them as questionable. Instead, clothing cascaded downward through the social categories like moisture flowing toward the ocean. A prosperous lady's dress worn for a period would be sold to a previously owned merchant who would sell it to a middle-class residence where it might be worn by a servant. When the servant had worn it out, it would return to the merchant who would sell it once more to somebody more impoverished. Ultimately, following numerous possessors and numerous maintenances, it would conclude up in locations like this, still recognisably a dress, still functional, but transporting the history of countless bodies in its connections. Here's an interesting fact that appears in records from Victorian fabric merchants. Certain previously owned merchants specialised in what they labelled alterations. This signified taking separated garments completely, unpicking every connection, recovering every usable fragment of material, and reconstructing them into something fresh. A gentleman's outer garment might become two youngsters' jackets. A lady's undergarment might become shirts for a complete household. It was recycling, taken to an extreme, propelled by requirement, and performed with surprising ability. The impoverished couldn't pay for squander. Every fragment of fabric had worth. The lady ascends and shifts toward a timber container in the section, the household storage such as it is. She extracts a bundle of material and commences sorting through it, inspecting for harm, evaluating what might be worn tomorrow. You observe that multiple items are somewhat moist, suspended near the blaze earlier in expectations of drying before daybreak. They won't be completely dry, they never are. But the household will wear them regardless, because the option is wearing nothing. There's ongoing debate among researchers about how labouring category Victorians genuinely encountered the sensation of being continuously frigid and moist. Certain investigators contend that the human body can adjust to almost anything, and that slum inhabitants merely developed a superior tolerance for discomfort. Others indicate to medical documentation displaying extraordinarily elevated rates of joint inflammation, arthritis, and respiratory sickness among the impoverished, evidence that their bodies were not adjusting so considerable as gradually deteriorating down. The reality is, likely both. You can become accustomed to misery. That doesn't signify the misery ceases. The spouse shifts near the blaze, and you observe he hasn't removed his outer garment, even though he's been interior for multiple instants now. Naturally, he hasn't. There's no purpose. The measurement interior this chamber is solely marginally warmer than beyond, roughly 45 degrees Fahrenheit on a beneficial night, more frigid than your refrigerator. Removing your outer garment in here would be like removing your outer garment in a meat storage. You'd merely have to position it back on once more. You comprehend that the distinction between interiors and exteriors scarcely exists in the slums. The partitions don't truly separate the two surroundings. They merely delay the exchange somewhat. Individuals attire for exteriors all the duration because they're effectively invariably exteriors. The blaze creates a modest bubble of warmth in the immediate vicinity, but advance 3 feet away and you might as well be positioned in the passage. This is why Victorian slum households rested in their garments, prepared in their garments, and quite possibly bathed in their garments on the rare occasions when bathing occurred. Unattiring was a vulnerability they couldn't pay for. The youngest young male has collapsed asleep against his sister, his expression peaceful in the blaze illumination. Even in rest, his modest palms clutch at the wrap enveloped around him. It's impulse now, that grasp. Release of your covering and the freeze will locate you, maintain, and you might make it to daybreak. He's acquired this lesson already at 4 years elderly, and he'll transport it in his body for the remainder of his existence. The blaze dulls somewhat as one of the coal chunks collapses into cinder. Nobody shifts to tend it yet. They're rationing, not merely frigid, but focus, delaying until the final possible instant to intervene. The freeze creeps a little proximate. Patient as invariably, you extract your personal coverings tighter, whatever they are, and sense the chill arranging into your articulations. The scent reaches you before you witness anything, something flavourful drifting up from the passage underneath, penetrating through the coal smoke and the moisture. Your stomach reacts before your consciousness does, contracting with an appetite you didn't understand you possessed. The lady observes and nearly grins. It's the pastry merchant, she clarifies. He arrives through the rookery every evening around this duration, advancing his vehicle, announcing his products. Penny pastries, warm or at least heated, or at least warmer than everything else. Nourishment in the Victorian slums was not about nutrition. It was not about satisfaction or household custom or any of the comfortable connections we bring to consuming presently. Nourishment was combustible, absolute, and simple. Energy converted into body warmth. Power altered into existence. And in winter that calculation became even more harsh. Your body combusts greater combustible when it's frigid, operating harder merely to sustain its measurement. The more starved you are, the more frigid you sense. The more frigid you sense, the more frantically you require to consume. It's a brutal cycle that the impoverished understood closely, even if they couldn't have clarified the science behind it. You make your manner to the glass pane, that sad newsprint, mended glass pane, and peer down into the passage. There he is, the pastry merchant, his vehicle illuminated by a modest petroleum lamp that makes the whole arrangement glow like something from a fairy narrative. Vapour ascends from beneath the fabric covering his products. A modest crowd has assembled, mostly youngsters, their expressions eager in the lamp illumination. Penny pastries, 1 penny for a portion of dough enveloped around something. The interior was invariably a mystery, and practised slum inhabitants understood superior than to request too numerous questions. Here's a conventional historical reality that nourishment researchers have recorded thoroughly. The penny pastry commerce was massive in Victorian London, with certain calculations proposing that hundreds of thousands of pastries were sold daily from passage vehicles alone. The standard ranged from acceptable to genuinely hazardous. Dishonest vendors were understood to utilise meat that had deteriorated, expanding it up with powder and seasonings to disguise the flavour. Certain pastries contained greater gristle than meat. Certain pastries contained cats, hounds or rats, though this was likely less typical than the sensational newspapers enjoyed to assert. Still, when you're starved and frigid and a warm pastry requires solely a penny, you don't perform a complete ingredient examination. You consume. The eldest young female has crept up beside you, her inhalation clouding the remaining glass. She's observing the pastry vehicle with a look you recognise, that specific mixture of desire and acceptance that arrives from desiring something you understand you cannot possess. A penny is substantial currency when you possess none. Her father acquired roughly 2 shillings presently, if he was fortunate. That currency has already been distributed, divided mentally among payment, coal, tomorrow's bread. There's no area in the mathematics for penny pastries. but the scent, deity, the scent. Even from up here, even through the shattered glass pane, you can capture hints of it. Dough and oil and something vaguely meaty, warm and substantial and authentic. Your mouth moistens. Hers does too. You witness her consume. The household's genuine dinner is considerably less romantic. The lady has generated a modest container and is preparing what resembles gruel. Oats boiled in moisture until they configure a greyish paste. No dairy, which would require extra. No sweetener, which would be an absurd indulgence. Merely oats and moisture and warmth altered into something that will position in your stomach and discharge its modest energy gradually through the night. She's incorporated a portion of salt, which is something. Salt makes almost anything consumable, or at least greater consumable than it would be otherwise. Here's an interesting fact that nutritional researchers enjoy pointing out. The Victorian impoverished genuinely possessed a remarkably advanced grasp of nourishment as combustible, even minus any formal education in science or biology. They understood that warm nourishment warmed you greater than frigid nourishment, not merely because of the measurement, but because the body didn't have to expend power warming it up internally. They understood that oily nourishments maintained you warmer, extended than lean ones. They understood that a meal before sleeping arrangement would assist you rest through the freeze. While proceeding to sleeping arrangement, starved signified awakening trembling at 3 in the daybreak. This was folk wisdom, gathered over generations, tested nightly in the laboratory of existence. The gruel bubbles over the modest blaze, and the lady stirs it with a timber spoon deteriorated smooth by years of application. The youngsters have positioned themselves in a semicircle, delaying. There's no surface. Surfaces occupy area and function-limited function. When you consume from vessels in your lap, there are no individual allocations either. Everyone will consume from the container, taking alternates with the spoon, observing to confirm no one takes greater than their distribution. It's shared dining enforced by scarcity. You consider about what you consumed presently. Whatever it was, however unremarkable it appeared at the duration, you likely didn't consider about it considerable. Nourishment is background sound for most of us, something we focus to when starved and disregard about immediately following. But here, in this chamber, nourishment is foreground. Nourishment is narrative. Nourishment is the distinction between resting and trembling, between labouring and collapsing, between existing and expiring. There's still debate among historians about whether the Victorian poor were genuinely starving or just malnourished. The difference matters more than you'd expect. Starvation means not enough calories, insufficient fuel to keep your body functioning. Malnutrition means lacking nutrients. Adequate fuel, maybe, but the wrong type. The evidence indicates that most slum dwellers suffered from the latter instead of the former. They consumed enough to stay alive, but what they consumed was so restricted, so repetitive, so lacking in vitamins and minerals that their bodies deteriorated in slower, more subtle ways. Scurvy was widespread. Rickets was epidemic among the young. Teeth dropped out. Bones grew fragile. You could eat daily and still be gradually dying from what you consumed. The hot potato vendors were the royalty of street food. If royalty can exist in such modest circumstances, potatoes were inexpensive, satisfying, and truly nutritious. One of the few foods accessible to the poor that actually provided vitamins. A hot potato on a freezing night was a minor miracle, something you could grasp in your hands and feel the warmth spreading through your gloves, something you could hold against your chest before consuming to capture a few extra moments of heat. The vendors wandered the streets with their tin ovens, the aroma of baking potatoes announcing their arrival blocks away. A halfpenny would buy you a small one, a penny would buy you something considerable. 2 pennies would buy you one with a dab of butter, though that was virtually fine dining. The woman scoops gruel into a chipped bowl and passes it to the eldest girl, who accepts it with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. The girl clutches it for a long moment before consuming, eyes shut, drawing the heat through her palms. It's a small ceremony, but you observe it repeated as each child receives their serving. Warmth first, then nourishment. The bowl matters as much as what's inside it. The man consumes last, as fathers frequently did, ensuring his children had sufficient before taking his own portion. The pot is almost empty by the time he scrapes the bottom. He doesn't protest. Protest would be ridiculous here, as meaningless as protesting about gravity. Outside, the pie man's cart has departed, his lamp vanishing around a corner. The aroma fades, the street returns to blackness, and the family consumes in silence, filling their stomachs with warmth against the long, frigid night ahead. The gruel has settled in your belly, a small, warm mass that reminds you what comfort resembles. But now you're becoming conscious of something else, a thirst developing slowly at the back of your throat. The coal fire has parched the air, and the salty gruel has left you craving water. Straightforward enough, you think. Just get a drink. But then you notice the woman glancing towards the door with a specific expression, and you recall where you are. Water isn't straightforward here. Water is a voyage. You follow her down the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath your feet. The sound reverberates through the building, mingling with coughs and whispers from behind shut doors. Other families, other existences, all crammed into this vertical labyrinth of frigid rooms. The stairwell is somehow colder than the room you departed. No fire here, no bodies creating heat. Just exposed walls and a draft that seems to blow from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Outside, the street strikes you like a blow. The temperature has fallen since sunset, and the frost has thickened on every surface. The cobblestones shine like they've been polished. Your breath emerges in great white clouds that hover in the air for a moment before dissolving into the blackness. The woman draws her shawl tighter and walks rapidly, her feet locating the safe paths between patches of ice. With practiced certainty, you follow less gracefully, feeling your shoes slide and grip with each step. The water pump stands at the corner of the street, a cast iron fixture that serves perhaps 200 people in the surrounding buildings. Even in the blackness you can observe the line, half a dozen figures hunched against the cold, buckets and jugs in hand, awaiting their turn. Nobody talks. Talking consumes energy, and energy is valuable. They simply stand, patient as livestock, shuffling forward one step at a time as the pump handle rises and drops. Here's a mainstream historical fact that public health officials recorded. Most Victorian slums depended on shared public pumps or standpipes for their water supply, and these sources were almost universally contaminated. The famous Broad Street pump outbreak of 1854, which helped establish the waterborne theory of cholera transmission, was just one dramatic instance of a constant problem. The pumps drew from shallow wells that sat directly beneath neighbourhoods where sewage leaked into the soil from overflowing cesspits and outdoor privies. People were essentially consuming their own waste, diluted and filtered through a few feet of London clay. In winter, at least, the cold slowed bacterial growth. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The woman reaches the front of the line and begins operating the pump handle. It resists initially, the mechanism's rigid with cold, and for a moment you wonder if it's frozen solid. But she understands this pump, knows its temperament, and she operates the handle with a specific rhythm until water begins to flow, a thin stream initially, then stronger, splashing into her bucket with a sound that seems almost melodic in the silent street. The water steams slightly as it strikes the cold air. It's not warm, not truly, but it's warmer than the air surrounding it, drawn from deep enough underground to escape the worst of the frost. You notice something interesting. She fills her bucket only 3/4 full. At first, this seems like a mistake, leaving capacity unused when you've waited so long in the cold. But then she explains in that dreamlike way, and it makes complete sense. A full bucket is heavy. A heavy bucket is slow. A slow walk home in this cold means the water begins to freeze before you reach your door. 3/4 full means lighter, faster, liquid. The arithmetic of survival extends even to how much water you transport. Here's an interesting detail that sanitation historians love to mention. During the coldest weeks of winter, the pumps would sometimes freeze completely, their internal mechanisms locked solid with ice. When this occurred, residents had two options. They could melt snow, tedious, fuel expensive, and the results tasted of soot and street filth. Or they could purchase water from entrepreneurial vendors who carted it in from unfrozen sources across the city, charging rates that the poor could barely manage. Some people simply went without, reducing their water consumption to almost nothing and hoping the freeze would break before their thirst became unbearable. You can survive longer without water than you might expect, but it's not pleasant. Nothing here is pleasant. The walk back feels longer than the walk out. The bucket pulls at the woman's arm, and you can observe her adjusting her grip, shifting the weight from one side to the other. The water sloshes gently, a liquid metronome marking each step. By the time you reach the building, a thin film of ice has already formed on the surface, proof that her 3/4 calculation was accurate. Any fuller, any slower, and she'd be transporting home a bucket of slush. But water is only half the sanitation equation, isn't it? What enters must exit, and that brings us to a topic the Victorians preferred not to discuss in polite company, though they had no option but to confront it daily in the slums. You ask in your wordless way about the facilities. The woman's expression tells you everything you need to understand, but she leads you out to the back of the building anyway, down a narrow alley that smells exactly as you'd anticipate. The privy stands at the end of the yard, a wooden structure roughly the size of a modern telephone booth shared by every family in the building. In summer, the smell is unspeakable. In winter, it's merely terrible, the cold muting but not eliminating the stench. The seat is a wooden plank with a hole cut in the centre, positioned over a cesspit that gets emptied in theory. Once a month, the night soil men arrive with their carts and shovels, hauling away the accumulated waste for sale to farmers outside the city. In practice, emptying happens when the landlord can be troubled to pay for it, which is not often. There's still debate among historians about how Victorian slum residents actually managed their sanitary needs during winter freezes. Some researchers point to chamber pot usage increasing dramatically, with the contents simply thrown from windows into the street below, the famous cry of Gardy Lou that warned pedestrians of incoming sewage. Others note that many people simply reduced their food and water intake to minimise the need for such unpleasant expeditions. A few accounts describe truly desperate measures, using shared night soil buckets in hallways, or even communal arrangements where multiple families would relieve themselves into a single container to reduce individual trips to the frozen privy. It's grim reading, but it's also a reminder of how much we take for granted. You don't actually use the privy, even in dreams. Some experiences are best imagined rather than lived. But you stand in the yard for a moment, looking up at the sliver of sky visible between the crowded rooftops. Stars are out, sharp and cold, utterly indifferent to the suffering below. The frost is beautiful, you realise, a delicate lacework coating every surface, sparkling faintly in the moonlight. Beauty and misery coexisting as they always do. The woman has already headed back inside, her precious water delivered, her brief journey into the cold complete. You follow, climbing the groaning stairs once more, returning to the room where the fire has burned lower and the children have fallen asleep in their pile of blankets and bodies. She pours some water into a small kettle and sets it near the flames to warm, not boiling. Boiling takes too much fuel, but warm enough to take the edge off. Tea will be made weak as memory and shared in small sips that warm from the inside out. The water in the bucket is already half frozen. It will be solid by morning, but for now there's enough liquid to drink, enough warmth to feel, enough life to keep going. The coughing wakes you. Or perhaps it never stopped. Perhaps it's been there all along, a constant backdrop to life in the rookery, so persistent that you'd stopped noticing. But now, in the deep hours of the night, with the fire burned to embers and the cold pressing close, the sound cuts through everything. It's coming from somewhere below, a wet, rattling cough that continues and continues, each spasm followed by a desperate gasp for air. Then another cough. Then another. The rhythm is almost hypnotic in its misery. The woman is awake too, you realise. She's sitting up on her corner of the mattress, listening. Her face in the dim glow is impossible to read, but something in her posture suggests she recognises that cough. She knows whose lungs are producing that terrible sound, and she knows what it means. Consumption, they called it. We call it tuberculosis now, a clinical name that strips away some of the Victorian horror. But consumption was the perfect word for what the disease did. It consumed you, devoured you from the inside out, hollowed you into a shell of yourself, over months or years of slow decline. The cough was just the beginning. Then came the night sweats, the fever, the weight loss, the blood-specked handkerchiefs, and finally the hemorrhage that ended everything in a rush of red. It was the single greatest killer of the Victorian age, responsible for roughly a quarter of all deaths in England during the 19th century. 1 in 4. In the slums, where overcrowding and poor ventilation created perfect transmission conditions, the rates were even higher. You listen to the coughing below and understand something visceral about disease in a way you never have before. This isn't abstract. This isn't a statistic in a public health report. This is sound, travelling through thin floors and thinner walls, carrying bacteria on every expelled breath, drifting upward through the cracks in the floorboards to where you sit. The very air in this building is shared, recycled, breathed and rebreathed by dozens of lungs. What enters one body can enter any body. The architecture of the slums was also the architecture of contagion. Here's a mainstream historical fact that medical historians have documented extensively. The Victorians understood that consumption spread between people, but they didn't understand how. The germ theory of disease wasn't established until the 1880s, and even then it took decades to translate into practical public health measures. Before that, doctors blamed consumption on everything from hereditary weakness to emotional distress to damp air. Some believed it was caused by disappointed love, the disease of poets and romantics wasting away from broken hearts. This sounds absurd now, but it made a kind of sense when you didn't know about bacteria. People got consumption after losing loved ones, after suffering grief and stress. The correlation was real. The causation was backwards. The cold made everything worse, of course. Winter drove people indoors, packed them closer together, reduced ventilation to almost nothing. A family that might survive summer in their cramped room with windows open and air circulating would spend winter sealed in with their own exhalations, sharing whatever pathogens circulated among them. The tuberculosis bacterium loves this environment. Warm bodies, stagnant air, close contact. Every cough sends thousands of infectious particles into the shared atmosphere. Every breath draws some of them in. The woman rises and moves quietly to check on her children. They're still asleep, their breathing soft and even. No coughs, not yet. She touches each forehead in turn, checking for fever, performing the instinctive diagnostics that mothers have practiced since the beginning of time. Finding nothing wrong, she returns to her place near the dead fire. But you notice she doesn't go back to sleep. She sits watching her children, listening to the coughing below, doing the terrible mathematics of proximity. Here's an interesting detail that shows up in accounts from Victorian slum visitors. Many families kept their consumptive members at home long past the point when institutional care might have been possible. Not because they didn't understand the danger, but because the alternatives were worse. The workhouse infirmary was dreaded almost universally, a place where you went to die among strangers, separated from everyone you loved. The fever hospitals were little better, so families kept their sick at home, nursed them in shared beds, held them as they coughed blood into shared air. Love and death intertwined in the most intimate possible way. But consumption wasn't the only predator stalking these streets in winter. You think of the water you helped carry earlier, drawn from that communal pump, and your stomach turns slightly. Cholera had swept through London multiple times in living memory. 1832, 1849, 1854, 1866. Each outbreak killing thousands. Each one concentrated most heavily in neighbourhoods exactly like this one. The disease moved through contaminated water with terrifying efficiency, causing such severe diarrhoea and vomiting that victims could die within hours of their first symptoms. The famous physician John Snow had traced the 1854 outbreak to the Broad Street pump, proving the waterborne connection. But clean water infrastructure was slow to follow. Many slum pumps remained contaminated well into the 1870s and beyond. Winter offered some protection from cholera, at least. The cold slowed bacterial growth, made the pumps marginally safer, reduced the explosive outbreaks that characterised summer months. But the trade-off was typhus, a disease spread by body lice, that thrived in exactly the conditions winter created when people crowded together for warmth, when bathing became impossible due to frozen water, when the same clothes were worn day after day without washing. The lice multiplied. And with the lice came fever, delirium, and death. Doctors called it jail fever or ship fever because it spread so readily in any confined, crowded space. The rookeries were effectively both. There's still debate among historians about how Victorian slum residents understood the relationship between dirt and disease. Some researchers argue that the poor were largely ignorant of hygiene principles, living in squalor because they knew no better. Others point to evidence that cleanliness was highly valued among the working class, pursued whenever resources allowed, abandoned only when survival demanded that other needs take priority. A family that spent their last coal money on fuel couldn't also spend money on soap. A woman who worked 14-hour days couldn't also boil water for bathing. The poor weren't dirty because they wanted to be. They were dirty because cleanliness was a luxury they couldn't afford. You hear the coughing below finally subside, replaced by an exhausted silence. Whoever it was has worn themselves out, at least for now. The respite won't last. It never does with consumption. But for a few hours, there might be peace. You find yourself breathing more shallowly, as if you could somehow filter the air through caution alone. It doesn't work that way, of course. The bacteria don't care about your intentions. The eldest girl stirs in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, then settles again. Her cheeks are flushed, which could mean nothing or could mean everything. Children sickened easily in the slums. Their smaller bodies, their still developing lungs, their tendency to put everything in their mouths made them perfect vectors for disease. Infant mortality rates in some rookeries approached 50%, half of all children dead before their 5th birthday. The Victorians mourned, certainly, but they also expected loss in a way we can barely comprehend. Having 4 children meant hoping 2 might survive to adulthood. The math was brutal, but familiar. The woman is still watching, still listening, still calculating odds. She has no power to influence, a mother's vigil against forces she cannot see and cannot fight. The cold is one enemy, disease is another. Both are patient, both are always waiting. Dawn is still hours away. The coughing starts again, weaker now, from somewhere in the building's depths. You pull your knees to your chest, making yourself smaller against the darkness. The grey light that eventually seeps through the paper-covered window isn't quite dawn. It's that pre-dawn greyness that tells you night has given up without morning having quite arrived. The woman is already moving, already preparing. and you realise with a sinking feeling that for most people in the rookeries, day doesn't begin when the sun rises. Day begins when work demands it, and work doesn't care about the cold. The husband is pulling on his coat, that archaeological garment you noticed earlier, layer upon layer of survival stitched together. His movements are stiff and slow. The cold has settled into his joints overnight, and you can observe him wince as he straightens his back. He's not old, you realise, maybe 30, maybe less, but his body has aged in ways his face hasn't quite caught up with yet. This is what labour does to a person. This is what winter does to labour. You follow him out into the street, leaving the family behind in their slowly warming room. The fire has been rekindled with the last of yesterday's coal, and the woman is preparing whatever passes for breakfast. More gruel, probably, or perhaps just hot water with a memory of tea. The children will be sent out soon too, if they're old enough to work. But for now it's the man and the cold and the long walk to wherever he earns the shillings that keep everyone alive. The streets are already busy, which surprises you until you remember the scale of Victorian London's labour force. Hundreds of thousands of people working, and a significant portion of them starting before sunrise. You fall into step beside him, joining a river of dark-coated figures, all moving in the same general direction, toward the docks, toward the factories, toward wherever the work is. Nobody speaks. Breath rises in white clouds. Feet crunch on frozen mud, and the city slowly comes alive around you. Here's a mainstream historical fact that labour historians have documented extensively. Outdoor work didn't stop for winter in Victorian London. It couldn't. The docks still needed unloading, the markets still needed stocking, the construction sites still needed builders. The economy had no off switch, no seasonal pause, no accommodation for the simple fact that human bodies weren't designed to work in freezing conditions for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch. You worked or you starved. That was the arrangement. The cold was your problem to solve. The docks materialise out of the morning mist, a forest of masts and rigging, a chaos of crates and barrels, a symphony of shouts and crashes and the endless groaning of timber against water. The Thames is half frozen near the banks, great plates of grey ice bumping against the pilings, but the channels are still clear. Ships still come and go, cargo still needs moving, and the casual labourers still gather at dawn, hoping to be selected for a day's work. You watch the hiring process, and it's grimmer than you imagined. A foreman stands on a raised platform, looking out over a crowd of perhaps 200 men. He needs 50. The rest will go home with nothing. No work, no pay, no coal money, no food. The men push forward, waving their arms, shouting their qualifications, trying to catch the foreman's eye. It's like watching an auction in reverse, where the merchandise is human desperation and the highest bidder is whoever looks strongest, youngest, most capable of surviving another day of brutal labour. The husband pushes forward with the rest. You observe his mouth moving, calling out, but his voice is lost in the general clamour. For a terrible moment, you think he won't be chosen. He's not the biggest man here, not the youngest, not the most obviously strong. But the foreman's finger stabs in his direction and relief floods his face. He's in. He'll work today. His family will eat tomorrow. Here's an interesting detail that shows up in accounts from dock workers themselves. Experienced labourers learn to position themselves in specific spots during the morning scramble, angles where the foreman's gaze naturally fell, places where the light hit their faces most favourably. It was a science of visibility, perfected through desperate repetition. Some men arrived hours early to claim the best positions. Others bribed gatekeepers for inside information about which foreman would be hiring. The competition for work was as strategic as any business negotiation, with stakes infinitely higher. The work itself begins immediately. No warm-up, no preparation, no gradual easing into effort. One moment the men are standing in the crowd, The next, they're hauling crates off a recently docked ship, carrying loads that would break most modern backs. The crates are covered in frost, and you watch the husband's hands slip and catch, his breath coming in great white plumes as he struggles with the weight. Gloves would help, but gloves cost money, and besides, you can't grip properly with gloves, so his bare hands close around frozen wood and the cold bites into his skin, and he keeps working because stopping means not being hired tomorrow. The irony isn't lost on you. Physical labour generates heat. An hour into the work, the husband has actually shed his outer layer, his body producing enough warmth through sheer exertion to make the coat unbearable. But this is a trap. The moment he stops for rest, for food, for the end of the shift, that sweat-soaked clothing will turn from insulation into an ice pack pressed against his skin. The walk home will be worse than the walk here. The night will be spent trying to dry clothes that never fully dry. The cycle repeats endlessly, work generating warmth, generating sweat, generating cold. There's still debate among historians about whether Victorian employers made any accommodations for winter conditions. Some researchers point to evidence of heated break rooms, hot drinks provided to workers, shortened shifts during the coldest snaps. Others argue these were exceptions so rare as to be meaningless gestures toward humanity in a system that fundamentally didn't value human welfare. The truth probably varied by industry and employer, but the overall pattern is clear. Workers adapted to conditions or were replaced by workers who could. You drift away from the docks and find yourself in one of the great covered markets. Covent Garden, perhaps, or Smithfield, or one of the dozens of smaller markets scattered across the city. Here the work is different, but no less punishing. Porters carry baskets of vegetables on their heads, the weight pressing down on necks and spines, their footing uncertain on floors slicked with ice and rotting produce. Butchers stand at their blocks with hands so cold they can barely feel the knives they're wielding, a recipe for accidents that happened with alarming frequency. The meat hanging from hooks is frozen solid, which at least keeps it fresh, but also makes it heavy, unwieldy, dangerous to handle. A young woman catches your attention. She's selling watercress from a basket, her voice hoarse from calling out her wares, her fingers red and cracked from constant immersion in cold water. Watercress sellers were the bottom rung of the market economy, buying their stock before dawn, selling it until it wilted, making perhaps a few pennies if they were lucky. She's been standing in this spot since 4 a.m. She'll stay until the last bunch is sold or spoiled. There's no shelter, no breaks, no relief from the cold except the movement of her feet, stamping constantly to keep blood flowing. The famous social researcher Henry Mayhew documented workers like her in exhaustive detail during the 1840s and 1850s. He interviewed hundreds of street sellers, labourers and casual workers, recording their words with something like anthropological precision. The picture that emerges is one of endless struggle, ingenuity born of necessity, and a kind of stubborn dignity that poverty couldn't quite extinguish. These people weren't defeated by their circumstances. They were fighting every single day using whatever weapons they had, strength, cunning, endurance, to survive until tomorrow. The husband will work until the light fails, roughly 10 hours in winter. He'll earn perhaps 2 shillings if he's paid fairly, slightly less if the foreman finds reasons to deduct. Then he'll walk home through streets that have grown colder as the sun set, his wet clothes stiffening with every step, his empty stomach reminding him that he hasn't eaten since morning. But he'll walk home with wages in his pocket, and that's what victory looks like. In the rookeries, the streets are full of children. You notice them now in a way you didn't before. Small figures darting between carts, huddled in doorways, standing at corners with trays of merchandise balanced on their thin arms. They're everywhere once you start looking. These tiny workers, these miniature adults carrying burdens no child should know. The rookeries didn't have childhood, not really. They had small people waiting to become big people, learning survival before they learned to read. You follow a boy of perhaps 7 as he makes his way toward the river. He's carrying a sack over his shoulder, empty for now, and his feet are bare despite the frost. Not shoeless by accident, shoes would be ruined by what he's about to do. He's a mudlark, one of the children who scavenge the Thames foreshore when the tide goes out, searching the freezing mud for anything valuable, coal fragments dropped from barges, copper nails, bits of rope, bones that can be sold to glue makers, anything that might fetch a farthing. The riverbank materialises before you, and the smell hits first, that distinctive Thames stench of rotting vegetation, industrial runoff, and something darker you'd rather not identify. The tide is out, exposing a wide expanse of grey-brown mud that glistens in the weak morning light. Already a dozen children are picking their way across it, bent double, hands plunging into the cold muck up to their elbows. Here's a mainstream historical fact that social researchers documented extensively. Mudlarking was almost exclusively the work of the very young and the very old, those too weak for heavier labour but too desperate to stay idle. Children as young as 5 were recorded working the foreshore, spending hours in freezing mud that could suck them under if they stepped wrong. The cold was brutal. Water temperature in winter hovered just above freezing, but the children waded in anyway, their legs turning blue, their teeth chattering so hard they could barely speak. The boy you've been following reaches the water's edge and doesn't hesitate. He steps into the mud, sinking immediately to his calves, and begins the slow, methodical search. His hands disappear beneath the surface, feeling for anything solid. You watch him pull up a piece of coal the size of his thumb, examine it briefly, and drop it in his sack. Then again, then again. Each piece represents perhaps 1/100th of a penny. He'll need hundreds to make his day worthwhile. Here's an interesting detail that observers of the time noted with something between horror and admiration. Mudlark children developed an almost supernatural ability to identify valuable items by touch alone. Their frozen fingers could distinguish coal from stone, copper from iron, bone from wood, all without seeing what they held. This was knowledge bought with suffering, expertise born from necessity. You turn away from the river and find yourself among the match sellers. These are mostly girls, some barely older than toddlers, standing on street corners with their boxes of matches held out to passing strangers. Their sales pitch is simple. "Buy my matches, sir." "Please, sir." "Only a penny, sir." The words come out in a kind of song repeated endlessly, a melody of desperation that most passers-by have learned to ignore. The matches themselves were dangerous to make. The phosphorus used in match heads caused a condition called phossy jaw, a horrifying deterioration of the jawbone that literally rotted the faces of factory workers. Children who sold matches didn't suffer this fate, but they suffered plenty of others, standing motionless in the cold for hours, being beaten if they returned home with unsold stock, falling asleep in doorways and freezing to death before morning. There's still debate among historians about how Victorian society justified child labour on this scale. Some scholars suggest that most people simply didn't view children as fundamentally separate from miniature adults. Childhood, as a sheltered stage, hadn't been completely established yet. Others reference economic justifications that were sincerely held. Labour taught children responsibility, protected them from darker outcomes, readied them for grown life. Still others mention the basic arithmetic of existence. Households required every revenue source they could secure, and children who didn't contribute meant children who went hungry. You encounter a crossing sweeper, a boy maybe 10 years old who stands at a crowded junction with a weathered broom, clearing routes through the horse manure and muck for gentlemen who flip him coins. His garments are tatters, his expression is hollow, but he guards his territory with a sort of territorial determination, driving away smaller children who attempt to intrude on his domain. This is his location. He's claimed it. The renowned author Charles Dickens, himself a child worker in a shoe polish factory, filled his stories with these street youngsters. The Artful Dodger, Oliver Twist, Joe the Crossing Sweeper from Bleak House. He grasped, in a manner that sheltered readers might not, that these weren't figures from fantasy. They were sketches from reality, somewhat softened for printing, depicting thousands of actual children whose identities nobody troubled to document. Evening is approaching now, and the children are returning home, those who possess homes. The Mudlark boy has loaded his bag with roughly £2 of assorted salvage. He'll trade it to a merchant for a few pennies, deliver the money to his mother, and repeat it all again tomorrow. The match girls are tallying their remaining inventory, figuring out how much difficulty they're facing. The crossing sweeper is searching for a doorway to shelter in somewhere away from the wind. You consider the children in the room where you began this evening. The three small forms clustered together for warmth, the eldest girl guarding her brothers with eyes too mature for her expression. They're the fortunate ones, in a sense. They possess a room. They have parents. They have one another. So many others possess nothing except the cold. The temperature keeps dropping. Somewhere in the rookeries, a child is drifting asleep for the final time, the cold claiming another small form that nobody'll notice until morning. This is what winter appeared like. At 3 feet tall, you're standing before a structure that resembles more a prison than a sanctuary. Tall walls of grey brick, tiny windows positioned too high to peer through, a massive wooden door that appears constructed to frighten rather than invite. Above the entrance, etched in stone, are words intended to be comforting. The poor shall never cease out of the land. It doesn't feel comforting. It feels like a threat. This is the workhouse, and everyone in the rookeries understands what it represents. The woman from your room mentioned this place once in that distant manner, her voice lowering to a whisper as if the walls themselves might listen. She'd prefer to die in the street, she said. She'd prefer to witness her children starve. Anything except the workhouse. You didn't comprehend then. You're starting to comprehend now. The workhouse arrangement was constructed with a specific philosophy. Make assistance so miserable that only the genuinely hopeless would request it. This wasn't brutality for its own purpose, or rather, it wasn't solely brutality for its own purpose. The designers of the 1834 Poor Law sincerely believed that generous aid would promote laziness, that comfortable poverty would multiply like a plague. So they established institutions deliberately worse than the worst external employment. If existence in the workhouse was horrible enough, people would attempt anything to escape it. Problem resolved. Here's a mainstream historical reality that social scholars have recorded extensively. Families entering the workhouse were instantly separated. Husbands from wives, parents from children, brothers from sisters. You might glimpse your family across the exercise yard, but you couldn't address them, couldn't touch them, couldn't console them in any manner. This separation was viewed essential to the system's moral objective. It was also, for numerous inmates, worse than the hunger and cold that had pushed them here in the first place. You observe a family approach the great door. A man, a woman, 2 children gripping their mother's skirt. They advance slowly, hesitantly, each step a surrender. The man's expression is a mask of disgrace. He's failed in the most basic duty Victorian society acknowledged, supporting his family. Whatever occurs next, that failure will brand him forever. The woman maintains her eyes lowered. The children don't comprehend, not truly, but they detect the dread in their parents' bodies and respond with a panic of their own. The door opens. A porter in a dark uniform examines them over with the indifferent efficiency of someone who's witnessed this scene 1,000 times. Documents are presented, questions are posed, and then the family steps inside. You follow, unseen, observing, as the separation commences. Immediately, the man is guided to the left, toward the men's ward. The woman and children are guided to the right. For one instant, the man extends out toward his wife, an automatic gesture, swiftly restrained. Then they're gone, absorbed into the grey mechanism of institutional charity. Here's an interesting detail that workhouse records disclose. Some families created elaborate methods to preserve contact despite the separation regulations. Messages transmitted through compassionate staff, signals traded across courtyards. Children committed information to memory to relay during the scarce moments when family members crossed paths. The human requirement for connection couldn't be regulated away, regardless how hard the authorities attempted. The interior of the workhouse is cold in a different manner than the rookeries. The slums were cold from poverty, from insufficient housing, from the simple lack of resources. This cold feels deliberate. The walls are whitewashed and empty. The floors are stone. The windows are high and narrow, permitting light but no warmth. Everything has been stripped of comfort by intention. You find yourself in the women's ward, observing as new arrivals are processed. Their clothes are confiscated, those precious layers of survival, those accumulated garments built up over years, and exchanged with workhouse uniforms. Shapeless grey dresses for the women, shapeless grey smocks for the children. Everyone appears the same now. Everyone appears like nobody. The work itself is deliberately meaningless. Women pick oakum, untangling old rope fibres until their fingers bleed. For hours each day, men crush stones in the yard, reducing boulders to gravel that nobody especially needs. The labour isn't intended to produce anything valuable. It's intended to be unpleasant enough to discourage future applicants, and it succeeds. The dread of the workhouse kept innumerable families struggling in the rookeries long past the point of logic, selecting slow starvation over this organised despair. There's still debate among historians about whether the workhouse arrangement actually preserved lives or simply made dying more systematic. Some scholars contend that without these institutions, many more would have died in the streets. Others reference mortality rates inside the workhouses, especially for children and the elderly, that indicate the remedy was often worse than the disease. The reality is probably both, which is to state, the reality offers no relief at all. But winter altered the calculation. You observe it in the expressions arriving at the door as the temperature drops. People who pledged they'd never come, who resisted as long as humanly possible, finally yielding to the cold. The workhouse was bleak. Yes, the workhouse was degrading, but the workhouse was also crucially indoors. There were fires in the common rooms. There was gruel at scheduled intervals. There were blankets, thin and coarse, but present when the alternative was freezing to death in a doorway. Even the workhouse began to appear like salvation. The children you observe here have a specific quality to their silence. They don't play, they don't laugh. They move through the routines, meals, work, sleep with a mechanical compliance that resembles nothing like childhood. Some of them have been here since infancy, born to mothers who had nowhere else to turn. They've never experienced anything else. The grey walls are their entire universe. You think of the family you've been tracking, warm in their wretched room with their dying fire and their shared blanket. They're still free. They're still together. The father selected the freezing docks over this place. The mother selected the frozen water pump. They chose suffering they could command over suffering imposed by strangers. But winter isn't finished yet. The coal won't last forever. The rent becomes due every week, and the workhouse door is always open, patient as death, awaiting the moment when cold finally defeats pride. You leave the workhouse behind and step back into the streets. But the city has transformed while you were inside. Night has fallen properly now. Not the grey twilight of early evening, but genuine darkness, the kind that Victorian London knew intimately, before electric lights altered everything. The gas lamps create small islands of yellow glow, but between them stretches shadow so dense it feels almost solid. You could lose yourself in that darkness. Many people do. The homeless surface at night. During the day they're invisible, sleeping in concealed corners, sheltering in churches, merging into the anonymous crowds of labourers and street sellers. But after dark, when the respectable world retreats behind locked doors, the streets belong to those who have no doors to lock. You see them now, emerging from alleyways and archways, claiming their spots for the night with the territorial precision of animals marking their territory. A woman has settled into a doorway just ahead, her back pressed against the wooden door, her legs drawn up beneath layers of ragged skirts. She's arranged newspapers around herself, not for reading, but for insulation. Paper retains warmth better than nothing, and nothing is what she has. Her eyes follow you as you pass, cautious but not frightened. She's survived too many nights to waste energy on fear. Here's a mainstream historical reality that census takers and social researchers documented with growing concern throughout the Victorian era. On any given night in London, tens of thousands of people slept rough. The 1861 census recorded over 11,000 people sleeping in the streets in London alone, and everyone acknowledged this was a severe undercount. The genuine number might have been 3 or 4 times higher. People who concealed from census takers, people who moved between locations, people who simply couldn't be located in the maze of alleys and abandoned buildings that honeycombed the city. You pass beneath a railway arch and the scene transforms. Here in the shadow of the iron bridge a small community has established. Perhaps 20 people are arranged in clusters, sharing body heat, sharing information, sharing the grim solidarity of the dispossessed. Someone has started a fire in an old barrel, illegal, dangerous, and absolutely essential. The flames cast dancing shadows on the brick walls, and faces lean towards the warmth, with an almost religious devotion. A man near the fire is explaining something to a younger companion, gesturing with hands wrapped in rags. You catch fragments of his counsel. Which churches distribute bread on which mornings? Which police constables will relocate you and which will look the other way? Which spots are protected from wind and which are death traps when the temperature really drops? This is survival knowledge transmitted through an oral tradition as ancient as poverty itself. The young man listens with the intensity of a student whose life depends on the lesson, because it does. Here's an interesting detail that appears in accounts from people who actually lived on Victorian streets. Experienced rough sleepers developed sophisticated strategies for staying warm that would impress any survival expert. They understood that sleeping against a wall was warmer than sleeping in the open, because the wall blocked wind and radiated whatever heat it had absorbed during the day. They understood that sleeping in groups, bodies pressed together, could raise the temperature by several degrees. They understood that covering your head was essential. More heat escapes through an uncovered head than anywhere else. They understood which buildings vented warm air from their basements, which grates released steam from underground kitchens, which spots near bakeries stayed warm from the ovens within. The irony isn't lost on you. These were some of the most knowledgeable people in the city about heat and cold, about the physics of survival. They had to be. Ignorance was fatal. You drift toward the river and discover a different population. The night workers, those whose labour occurred in darkness. Coffee stall keepers tending their steaming urns, selling penny cups to cab drivers and watchmen. Prostitutes clustered near the street lamps, their faces garishly painted, their thin dresses utterly inadequate for the cold. Pie men still making their rounds, though their wares have gone cold hours ago. The economy never fully slept, even at midnight. Even in winter, there was always someone buying, someone selling, someone attempting to scrape together the pennies that meant survival. A coffee stall draws you close. The smell is incredible. Roasted beans and hot water, and something that might generously be called sugar. The keeper is an elderly woman, her face lined like a map of hard years. But her hands move with practiced efficiency as she serves customer after customer. Her stall is a gathering point. You realise people linger here not just for the coffee, but for the warmth of the charcoal brazier she tends, for the company of other humans in the lonely night. for the few minutes of almost comfort before they return to the cold. There's still debate among historians about how London's nighttime economy functioned during winter months. Some researchers emphasise the desperation, people working through the night because daytime jobs didn't pay enough, selling their bodies or their labour at whatever price the darkness would bear. Others highlight the resilience and creativity, the way communities formed among night workers, the mutual aid networks that developed in the shadows. Both perspectives are accurate. Desperation and resilience aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. You remember the family in the room where this night began, the woman watching her children sleep, the husband resting before another day at the docks. They have walls. At least they have each other. The people out here have only the cold and whatever warmth they can borrow from strangers. A young boy darts past you, moving with purpose toward a spot beneath an overhang where several other children have gathered. Street Arabs, they were called. Homeless children who formed their own societies in the gaps between the adult world. They had hierarchies, rules, territories. They looked after each other with a fierce loyalty born of necessity. Tonight they'll sleep in a pile like puppies, their small bodies generating just enough heat to keep each other alive. The night stretches on, endless and cold. Somewhere a church bell tolls 2 o'clock. 5 more hours until dawn. 5 more hours of fighting the cold with whatever weapons are available. Fire, paper, bodies, movement, sheer, stubborn will. The woman in the doorway has fallen asleep, her chin tucked against her chest. Her breath comes in small white puffs that fade into the darkness. She looks almost peaceful. You hope she wakes up. Not everyone does. The fog arrives without warning. One moment the street is visible, dark, cold, but navigable. The next moment, the world vanishes. It rolls in from the river like something living, swallowing everything in its path, erasing the gas lamps, the buildings, the very concept of distance. Within minutes, you can't see your own hand at arm's length. The darkness has become three-dimensional, a substance you could almost touch. This is the famous London fog, the pea souper, the particular thick yellow-brown miasma that gave Victorian London its reputation as the smokiest city on earth. Except it's not really fog at all, not in any natural sense. It's coal smoke trapped by weather conditions, millions of fires pouring their exhaust into air too cold and still to carry it away. The city is choking on its own breath. The smell hits you first, sulphur and soot and something acrid that burns the back of your throat. Then the taste, because you can taste this fog, a greasy residue coating your tongue and teeth. Then the feeling in your lungs, a tightness that grows with every breath. You cough, and the sound is immediately swallowed by the murk. Somewhere nearby, other people are coughing too, a chorus of strangled sounds coming from every direction and no direction at all. Here's a mainstream historical reality that medical records documented with alarming precision. London's fog killed people, not metaphorically, not gradually, but directly and immediately. The Great Fog of December 1873 was blamed for over 700 excess deaths in a single week. The fog of 1880 killed roughly 2,000. These weren't weak or elderly victims exclusively, though they died in greatest numbers, but working people, healthy people, people whose lungs simply couldn't process air that had become more poison than oxygen. They went to sleep coughing and didn't wake up. You stumble forward, one hand trailing along the wall beside you, the only way to maintain any sense of direction. The bricks are slick with condensed moisture, that distinctive black grease that coated every surface in Victorian London. Your fingers come away dark. Tomorrow, if you survive until tomorrow, you'll blow your nose and the handkerchief will be black. You'll cough up black phlegm. The fog gets inside you and stays there. The poor suffered most, of course. They always did. Wealthy Londoners could retreat to their well-sealed homes, their fires burning smokeless coal that cost 3 times the price of the cheap stuff. They could stuff rags under their doors and wait for the weather to change. But in the rookeries where windows were broken and walls were permeable, the fog came inside. It filled the rooms where families huddled, mixing with the smoke from their own fires, creating a toxic soup that offered no escape. You couldn't outrun fog. You couldn't afford to. Here's an interesting detail that appears in accounts from fog-bound Londoners. People developed elaborate systems for navigation. When visibility dropped to 0, they followed the curb with their feet, counting paces between landmarks they'd memorised in clearer weather. They listened for familiar sounds, church bells, factory whistles, the particular echo of certain streets. Some hired link boys to walk ahead with torches, though the torches were nearly useless in the thickest fogs. Others simply stayed put, refusing to move until conditions improved, sleeping in doorways rather than risk getting lost in a city they'd lived in all their lives. You think of the children you saw earlier, the mudlarks, the match sellers, the crossing sweepers. Where are they now? Some have found shelter, you hope, but others are still out here, lost in the yellow murk, breathing poison because they have nowhere else to be. The homeless under the railway arch have it slightly better. The arch provides shelter from the worst of it, but even there the fog finds its way in, filling lungs already weakened by cold and hunger. The sounds of the city have changed. Voices call out from the darkness, people searching for landmarks, for companions, for help. A horse whinnies somewhere, its driver cursing as he tries to navigate a cart through streets he can no longer see. Someone is crying, the sound thin and lost. The normal rhythm of London has been replaced by this strange, muffled chaos. A city of blind people stumbling through a world that ceased to exist. There's still debate among historians about whether Victorians understood the connection between coal smoke and the deadly fogs. Some researchers argue that the link was obvious and widely acknowledged, but economic interests prevented any meaningful action. Coal was king. The factories ran on coal. The trains ran on coal. Every home burned coal. To restrict coal was to threaten the entire economy. Others suggest that scientific understanding was genuinely limited, that people blamed the fogs on river mist, on divine punishment, on anything except the fuel that powered their prosperity. The reality probably lies somewhere between. People knew, they just couldn't afford to care. You find yourself near the river again, though you can't see the water. You can hear it, though, the slap of waves against the embankment, the groan of boats straining at their moorings. The fog is thicker here, fed by moisture rising from the Thames, and you can feel it pressing against your skin like a damp cloth held over your face. Breathing is work now. Each inhale requires conscious effort. A figure materialises beside you, an elderly man, his face wrapped in a scarf that's turned black with filtered soot. He's been walking the riverbank for hours, he tells you, in that dreamlike way, trying to find his way home. He lives in Southwark, just across the bridge. But he can't find the bridge. He's walked past it 3 times, maybe 4. The fog has stolen his city from him. He'll keep walking until dawn if he has to. What else can he do? You walk together for a while, 2 blind souls in a blind world. The fog muffles your footsteps, muffles your breathing, muffles everything, until the silence becomes its own kind of pressure. This is what winter in Victorian London could become. Not just cold, but invisible. Not just dangerous, but disorienting. A season that attacked not only your body, but your sense of where you were in the world. The elderly man eventually finds his bridge, or a bridge, and disappears into the murk with a muttered thanks. You're alone again, standing in a city of 4 million people, unable to see a single one. The fog will lift eventually, it always does. But until then, London waits and breathes and slowly poisons itself. The fog begins to thin as you make your way back toward the rookeries, and with visibility comes something unexpected. Light spilling from a doorway, voices raised, not in argument, but in something almost like laughter. You follow the sound, drawn by the simple human need for warmth and company, and find yourself standing outside a public house. The sign above the door is too weathered to read, but it doesn't matter. What matters is the golden glow leaking through the windows, the promise of heat and noise and life. You step inside and the change is immediate. The cold releases its grip. The fog stays outside, held back by walls and bodies and the fierce heat of a coal fire burning in a proper grate. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of bodies and something yeasty. Beer, of course, but also the particular funk of wool drying near flames. Every available surface near the fire is draped with wet clothing, steaming gently as the heat works its way through the fibres. This is the public house in its role as community centre, warming station and social hub. The Victorians understood something we've largely forgotten. When your home can't keep you warm, you need somewhere else to go. The pub served that function for the working poor, a place where a penny would buy you a seat near the fire and permission to stay as long as you were drinking. It wasn't charity, it was business, but it kept people alive. Here's a mainstream historical reality that temperance reformers documented with great frustration. Public house attendance spiked dramatically during cold weather, and not primarily because people wanted to drink more, they wanted to be warm. A family that couldn't afford enough coal to heat their own room might pool their resources for a few pints and spend the evening in a heated pub instead. The mathematics made sense. Why burn coal at home when someone else was already burning it here? You find a corner and settle in, watching the room arrange itself around you. There's a hierarchy, you notice. Regulars near the fire, newcomers farther back, the truly desperate hovering near the door, hoping to absorb whatever warmth drifts their way without being asked to buy anything. The publican tolerates this to a point. Even he understands that turning people out into the cold is bad for business and worse for the soul. A group of women has claimed the table nearest the hearth, and you recognise one of them, the woman from the room where this night began. She's left her children with a neighbour, she explains in that wordless way of dreams. Just for an hour, just long enough to feel her fingers again. The other women nod. They understand. They've all made the same calculation, weighing the cost of a drink against the cost of another night in the cold, choosing this small warmth over tomorrow's bread. Here's an interesting detail that appears in accounts from Victorian social workers. Women in the slums developed extensive mutual aid networks that operated largely invisible to outside observers. They shared childcare, rotating which mother watched multiple families' children so others could work or rest. They shared food when someone had extra and others had none. They shared information about which landlords were lenient, which employers were hiring, which charities were distributing aid. These networks weren't formal organisations. They were survival systems built on trust and reciprocity and the understanding that everyone needed help sometimes. The gin is flowing at the women's table. Not much, just enough to take the edge off, just enough to create that gentle blur that makes hardships slightly more bearable. Gin was the drink of the poor, cheaper than beer per unit of oblivion, faster acting, more efficient at its job of making you forget. The temperance movement railed against it constantly, blaming gin for every social ill from poverty to crime to moral decay. They weren't entirely wrong. Alcoholism was a genuine problem, but they missed the point. People didn't drink because they were weak. People drank because they were cold and tired and desperate, and gin was warm going down. The conversation at the table shifts and flows. Someone's husband has found work at a warehouse. Someone else's child has recovered from a fever. A landlord on the next street has been arrested for something unspeakable. The gossip of poverty, the news that matters when newspapers cost more than you can spare. These women are each other's information network, each other's support system, each other's reminder that they're not alone. There's still debate among historians about whether community bonds in Victorian slums were stronger or weaker than in modern society. Some researchers romanticise the past, imagining tight-knit neighbourhoods where everyone helped everyone and no one was truly alone. Others point to evidence of fierce competition for scarce resources, of theft and violence, and the every man for himself mentality that desperation can breed. The reality, as always, is complicated. Community existed, so did conflict, often between the same people on different days, depending on how much there was to share. A man near the fire begins to sing an old ballad, something about lost love and distant shores, his voice rough but tuneful. Others join in, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. The song fills the room, rising above the crackle of the fire and the clink of glasses. For a moment, just a moment, the cold outside ceases to exist. There's only this warmth, these voices, and the simple pleasure of being human among humans. You think of everything you've seen tonight, the frozen pumps, the coughing in the darkness, the children in the mud, the workhouse doors, the fog that kills. So much suffering, so much struggle, so much fighting just to survive until morning. And yet, here, in this smoky room, people are singing, people are laughing, people are sharing what little they have with neighbours who have even less. This is what the reformers and the moralists never quite understood. The poor weren't just surviving, they were living, finding joy where they could, creating community in the gaps between hardships, insisting on their humanity even when the world seemed determined to deny it. Warmth isn't just temperature. Warmth is also this: connection, belonging, the knowledge that someone will notice if you don't come home. The woman from your room catches your eye and raises her glass in a small salute. Tomorrow will be hard. The cold will return. The struggles will continue. But tonight, for this 1 hour, she's warm. She's among friends. She's almost happy. The fire crackles. The singing continues. Outside, the fog slowly lifts, and in this small room, winter loosens its grip just slightly. Just enough. The singing fades as you step back into the street, and the cold reasserts itself immediately, that patient, persistent enemy that never truly left, only waited. The fog has lifted enough to see the stars now, sharp and distant, utterly indifferent to the struggles below. You walk slowly through the rookeries and something has changed in your perception. You're noticing things you didn't before. A bundle of rags in a doorway that might be a person, a still shape beneath a market stall, the particular silence of bodies that have stopped fighting. Death was ordinary here. That's the thing the history books sometimes fail to convey. We read the statistics, thousands dead from cold, from disease, from hunger, and the numbers are so large they become abstract. But in the rookeries, death wasn't a statistic. It was the neighbour who didn't answer her door. It was the old man who used to sit on the corner, suddenly absent. It was the child who coughed all week and then stopped coughing, and everyone knew what the silence meant. Here's a mainstream historical reality that mortality records, documented with clinical precision. Winter deaths in Victorian London exceeded summer deaths by a significant margin every single year. The peak came in January and February when the cumulative effects of cold, hunger and disease converged into a killing season. In bad years, the excess mortality could reach into the thousands. People who would have lived if the weather had been kinder, if they'd had more coal, if their lungs hadn't already been weakened by a lifetime of breathing polluted air. You pass a house with a wreath on the door, not the festive kind, but the mourning kind. Black crape arranged in a circle to announce a death within. In wealthier neighbourhoods, such wreaths were elaborate affairs, professionally made, displayed with sombre pride. Here, it's just a scrap of dark fabric tied with string, but it serves the same purpose. Someone inside has died. The neighbours know to speak softly as they pass. The dead presented practical problems that the living had to solve. Bodies needed to be washed, dressed and laid out, work that fell to women, usually performed in the same rooms where families continued to eat and sleep. In winter, at least the cold helped preserve the body while arrangements were made. You're walking through Philadelphia in the winter of 1893, and the cold hits you like a physical thing. Not the clean cold of snow-covered fields, but the dense, penetrating cold of a city built on stone and iron. It seeps through your coat, through your skin, settles into your bones, with the patient determination of something that knows it will win eventually. The streets are narrow here, buildings leaning in so close their upper floors nearly touch, blocking what little daylight might have existed. But it's night now, well past midnight, and the darkness is absolute except for the occasional gas lamp flickering on its post. The light it throws is weak, yellowish, barely enough to see your own feet on the cobblestones. You keep moving because standing still is worse. Movement generates heat, even if it's just the friction of your own muscles working, the blood being forced through constricted veins. Your breath comes out in clouds that hang in the air for a moment before disappearing. Each exhale is heat leaving your body, warmth you can't afford to lose, but there's no way to stop it. The tenements rise around you, 5 or 6 stories of brick and rotting wood, their facades streaked with soot. Smoke pours from chimneys, coal smoke that hangs heavy over everything, mixing with the fog rolling in from the Delaware to create a thick, choking haze. You can taste it in the back of your throat, metallic and bitter. Inside those buildings, families are packed together, 2 or 3 or 4 to a room, sleeping in shifts because there aren't enough beds. The walls are thin, barely insulated, and the windows don't quite close properly, letting in drafts that make the candles flicker. You can hear them if you listen. The coughs, the crying of infants, the low murmur of voices speaking in languages that mark them as recent arrivals. Irish, Italian, Polish, German. The city absorbs them all, presses them into these narrow streets and extracts their labour in exchange for the bare minimum required to keep them alive. Most don't own proper winter coats. You see them on the streets, wrapped in whatever they could find. Thin shawls, threadbare blankets, jackets sized for warmer months. Children run past in boots several sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper to make them fit. The newspaper serves 2 purposes, filling space and providing a thin layer of insulation against the frozen ground. It's a small calculation, one of hundreds that poor families make every day. How to stretch limited resources across unlimited needs. A woman stands at a street corner selling apples from a wooden crate. She's been there for hours, you can tell by the way she shifts her weight from foot to foot, trying to keep blood flowing to her extremities. Her hands are bare because gloves would make handling coins difficult, and she can't afford to drop one in the dark and spend precious minutes searching. Those hands are raw, the skin cracked and bleeding in places, and they'll only get worse as winter deepens. She calls out to you, her voice hoarse, offering her apples for 2 cents each. You shake your head and keep walking. You don't have 2 cents to spare, and she knows it as soon as she looks at you. She's already turning to the next person, the next potential sale, her breath rising in white puffs as she repeats her practiced pitch. Here's something the city records show clearly. Frostbite was common among street vendors and labourers who worked outdoors. Fingers and toes turned black, had to be amputated in the charity wards, if they made it to the charity wards at all. Many simply endured the pain, bound their damaged extremities in rags, and kept working because not working meant not eating. The human body is remarkably resilient, but it's also remarkably fragile. The line between survival and failure is thinner than most people realise. You pass an alley where a fire burns in a steel drum, scrap wood and trash feeding the flames. A cluster of men huddle around it, holding their hands out to the heat, absorbing whatever warmth they can before the wood runs out and they have to move on. Nobody speaks. The fire hisses and pops, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness, and the men watch it with the blank expressions of people who've learned not to expect much. One of them coughs, a deep rattling sound that goes on too long. Tuberculosis, probably. The White Plague, they call it, though there's nothing white about it except the pallor it leaves on its victims' faces. In these crowded tenements it spreads like wildfire, jumping from one person to the next through shared air, shared cups, shared beds. There's no cure, no treatment beyond rest and fresh air, and nobody here can afford either. You think about the family you saw earlier, 4 flights up in a building that should have been condemned years ago. A man, a woman, 3 children under the age of 10. They live in a single room, maybe 12 feet square, with one window that looks out onto a brick wall 3 feet away. The man works at the docks when there's work, which isn't every day. The woman takes in laundry, standing over a washboard for hours, her knuckles bleeding from the lye soap and rough fabric. The children are too young to work legally, but the oldest helps deliver the laundry, earning a few pennies that might buy bread. Their room costs $8 a month, which seems impossible when you consider what they're getting. But housing is scarce, and landlords know they can charge whatever they want. Families pay or they sleep in the streets, and sleeping in the streets in this cold is a death sentence. So they pay, and they eat less, and they wear clothes until they fall apart. And they hope that nothing unexpected happens because there's no margin for error, no safety net to catch them if they fall. Winter deaths were the worst, bodies stiffening in the cold before anyone could arrange for their removal. But summer deaths had their own horror, the heat accelerating decay, turning small rooms into charnel houses within hours. The cost of burial remained constant regardless of season, regardless of how little money the deceased had left behind. Here's something that burial society records reveal. Many poor families kept their dead at home for days or even weeks, not from any desire to maintain a vigil, but from sheer financial necessity. A proper burial required money. The coffin, the plot, the undertaker's fee. Families had to save up dollar by dollar while the body waited in the corner, covered with whatever clean cloth they could spare. A presence that dominated the room, that couldn't be forgotten or ignored, that had to be lived with while the living scraped together enough funds to dispose of it properly. Children grew up intimate with death in a way that modern sensibilities can barely comprehend. It wasn't hidden from them, wasn't softened or euphemized. It couldn't be, not in rooms that small, not in lives that precarious. You think of the coughing you heard earlier, that wet, productive sound drifting down from an upper floor. Consumption worked slowly, sometimes taking months or years to complete its task, but it always completed it eventually. The family would watch their loved one waste away, growing skeletal, coughing blood into rags that had to be burned, until finally the coughing stopped and the silence was permanent. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments beyond hope and prayer. And hope was cheap, but prayer heated no rooms. There was only time, and time always ran out. The city death registers told the story in neat columns of ink. Cause of death? Tuberculosis. Cause of death? Pneumonia. Cause of death? Exposure. Cause of death? Marasmus, that catch-all term for bodies that had simply given up, worn down by cold and hunger until some final small insult pushed them past the point of no return. The clerks who recorded these deaths rarely noted the underlying cause, poverty itself. Poverty killed more people than any disease, any accident, any act of violence combined. But there was no column for that. There's ongoing debate among historians about how American society understood the connection between poverty and mortality. Some scholars argue that most people accepted high death rates among the poor as natural, inevitable, perhaps even justified as evidence of moral or physical weakness. The poor had always died young. They would always die young. Others point to the reform movements that gained momentum throughout the era: settlement houses, sanitation campaigns, labour regulations, as proof that many Americans recognised these deaths were preventable and fought to prevent them. Progress happened, slowly and painfully. But for the people living through these winters, progress was an abstract concept that did nothing to warm their children or fill their stomachs. You find yourself near a small church, its steeple barely visible against the low clouds. The churchyard is crowded, centuries of bodies layered beneath the frozen ground, the earth raised several feet above street level from accumulated dead. In some city graveyards, coffins were stacked 5 or 6 deep, disturbed and rearranged each time a new burial required space. The smell in summer was notorious. Even in winter there was something heavy in the air near these places, something that suggested endings. A woman emerges from the church, her face drawn. She's been making arrangements, probably for someone who didn't make it through the week. You watch her disappear into the darkness, her shoulders hunched, carrying her grief like additional weight added to everything else she already bears. Tomorrow she'll return to work, because work doesn't pause for mourning. The children will need feeding. The rent will come due. Life insists on continuing, even when you lack the strength for it. Americans had a complicated relationship with death. Elaborate mourning customs for those who could afford them, hasty burials for those who couldn't. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning for Prince Albert had influenced fashion and sentiment across the Atlantic, turning grief into a kind of performance for those with the resources to stage it. But in the tenements, there was no time for extended mourning rituals. You buried your dead and moved forward because standing still meant joining them. The stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that watched over last winter's dead and will watch over next winter's. The cold doesn't care about your grief. The cold doesn't care about anything. It simply exists, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when resistance finally fails. You pull your thin coat tighter and keep walking. The living still need tending to. The smell reaches you before you see its source. Roasted peanuts, rich and smoky, cutting through the frozen air like a promise. You follow it around a corner and there he is, a peanut vendor hunched over his brazier, coals glowing orange in the darkness. A small island of warmth in the frozen street. His hands move automatically, turning the nuts in their pan, and the sound of them roasting is almost musical, small pops and cracks that speak of heat and transformation. 5 cents buys you a small paper bag. The peanuts are still hot enough to burn your fingers. You hold them against your chest first, stealing their warmth through your coat, feeling the heat radiate into your body before you've eaten a single one. This is the trick everyone knows. Food is fuel, yes, but heat is immediate. You can warm yourself with hot food twice. Once by holding it, once by consuming it. Nothing is wasted here. Nothing can be wasted. The first bite is extraordinary, not because the peanut is exceptional. It's slightly burned in spots, slightly raw in others, but because warmth itself is extraordinary. When you've been cold for hours, the soft, oily flesh dissolving on your tongue feels like salvation. You can feel it travelling down, a small ember joining whatever heat remains in your core. For maybe 30 seconds, maybe a full minute, you're not cold. You're almost comfortable. It's enough. It has to be enough. Here's something that food historians have documented extensively. The street food economy of American cities in the 1890s was vast and surprisingly sophisticated. Peanuts in winter, ices in summer, sausages year-round. Vendors adapted their offerings to the season and the customer base, providing hot food to those who couldn't afford fuel to cook their own. For many tenement residents, street food wasn't a convenience, it was a requirement. Their rooms had no proper kitchens, their coal was too precious to waste on cooking, and their time was consumed by work. The peanut vendor and the sausage man were essential infrastructure, as vital to survival as the water pump or the privy. You linger near the brazier, reluctant to leave its warmth. The vendor doesn't mind. He's accustomed to people gathering around him like moths around flame. A small crowd has formed. A woman with an infant bundled inside her coat, an old man with a persistent cough, two boys who clearly can't afford to buy anything but hover at the edge of the heat anyway. Nobody speaks much. There's a companionable silence, a shared understanding that this moment is precious and temporary. The infant fusses and its mother adjusts her grip, pressing it closer to her body. You notice that she's positioned herself deliberately, her back to the wind, the brazier's warmth reaching her front where the child is nestled. Every calculation matters, every small advantage is exploited. She probably walked several blocks to find this particular vendor, knowing his corner is sheltered, knowing she can stand here longer without being moved along by police or property owners. Here's something that shows up in accounts from urban street life. Regular customers developed relationships with their vendors that transcended simple commerce. The peanut seller knew which families were struggling, which children were hungry, which old people couldn't afford full price. He'd add an extra handful to a bag, pretend not to notice when payment came up short, save his best stock for those who needed a small kindness. It wasn't charity exactly, it was community. The web of small generosities that made survival possible in an environment designed to prevent it. You finish your peanuts and move on, but the warmth lingers in your stomach, a memory of comfort that your body clings to. These moments mattered more than any grand reform, any political speech, any charitable foundation. A hot peanut on a frozen night, a seat by someone else's fire, a shared blanket when the temperature dropped. The poor survived on such moments, stringing them together like beads, each one a small victory against the cold. The saloon you visited earlier is closing now, its warmth spilling out one last time as the doors open and the final customers emerge. They stand blinking in the cold, reluctant to leave the light, postponing the walk home as long as possible. A man and woman lean against each other, not quite drunk but softened by drink, their bodies sharing heat through contact. They'll walk home like this, pressed together, generating warmth through friction and closeness. There's ongoing debate among historians about whether physical affection was more or less common among the urban poor compared to the middle classes. Some researchers argue that crowded conditions and shared sleeping arrangements made physical boundaries impossible, normalizing touch in ways that respectable society would have found shocking. Others suggest that the poor internalized the same modesty standards as everyone else, struggling to maintain propriety even when privacy was impossible. The truth probably varied enormously, from family to family, from block to block, from one desperate night to the next. You think of the family you've been following through this long night. By now, the children are deep asleep, piled together on their mattress, their breathing synchronized in the unconscious rhythm of siblings who've never slept alone. The woman is probably awake still, listening to the sounds of the building, the coughs and murmurs that filter through walls thin as paper. The man sleeps heavily, exhausted from his day at the docks, his body recovering for tomorrow's labour. They're together. That's something. That's everything, really. A coffee cart is still operating near the market, its keeper brewing her last pot of the night. You stop for a cup. Thin and bitter and barely warm, but warm nonetheless. The cup itself is the real treasure, a vessel you can wrap your hands around, a source of heat that seeps through the cheap tin into your frozen fingers. You drink slowly, making it last, watching the steam rise and vanish into the darkness. The coffee seller is packing up her cart, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this 1,000 times. Her night is ending. Her bed, wherever it is, awaits. She catches your eye and nods, a small acknowledgement between two souls who've survived another night in the cold. No words are necessary. The nod says everything you need to know. You set down the empty cup and turn toward the tenements. Dawn is still hours away, but the worst of the night has passed. The temperature will hold steady now until sunrise. The fog won't thicken. The small warmths you've gathered, peanuts, coffee, The memory of firelight will carry you through. Survival is made of moments like these, accumulated and hoarded, spent carefully. When the cold demands payment, you've learned to count your warmth like coins. Your wandering has brought you to a different kind of street. You didn't mean to come here, or perhaps you did, drawn by some unconscious curiosity about how the other half lives. The buildings are taller here, the windows larger, the gas lamps more numerous and better maintained. The smell is different too, cleaner somehow, though the same cold air fills your lungs. You've crossed an invisible border into another Philadelphia entirely, and the contrast is so stark, it feels almost violent. A mansion rises before you, its facade glowing with warm light from a dozen windows. Through the glass you can see chandeliers blazing, their crystals catching and multiplying the flames of countless candles. Figures move inside, women in elaborate gowns, men in dark evening dress, their silhouettes graceful and unhurried. They're hosting a party, you realise. A winter ball, perhaps, or a dinner that's stretched into the small hours. The sound of music drifts faintly through the walls, something delicate played on a piano, utterly foreign to the streets you've been walking all night. You stand at the iron fence that separates the sidewalk from the house's front garden, and you watch. The glass is frosted at the edges, but the centre is clear enough to see the fire burning in the main room, not a small grate struggling to heat a single chamber, but a massive fireplace with flames leaping 3 feet high. The warmth radiating from that fire could heat an entire tenement building. Here it heats one room where people who are already warm gather to admire its glow. Here's something that economic historians have documented extensively. The gap between rich and poor in American cities in the 1890s was among the most extreme in human history. The wealthiest families spent more on a single dinner party than a tenement family earned in a year. They heated their homes with anthracite coal, the expensive, smokeless variety that burned clean and hot, while the poor choked on cheap, bituminous coal that filled their rooms with toxic fumes. They wore furs imported from Canada, silk shipped from China, wool so fine it felt like air against the skin. Their children had nurseries with dedicated fireplaces, kept burning day and night by servants whose own quarters were barely warmer than the streets outside. A carriage pulls up to the house, its horses breathing steam into the cold air. A footman jumps down to open the door, and a woman emerges, wrapped in what must be mink, its dark colour catching the lamplight. She moves quickly up the steps. Even the wealthy don't like the cold. The door opens to receive her, releasing a gust of warm air that you can almost feel from where you stand. Then the door closes, and the warmth is gone, locked away behind walls you'll never enter. The servants are visible too, if you know where to look. A face in an upper window watching the party below. A figure hurrying across the back courtyard, carrying something cold, probably, to feed one of the many fires. The wealthy didn't heat their own homes, didn't carry their own water, didn't empty their own chamber pots. They paid others to do it, and those others lived in the gaps between the grand rooms, in attic quarters with sloped ceilings, in basement kitchens where the only warmth came from the cooking fires. Here's something that shows up in accounts from domestic servants. The temperature differential within a single wealthy household could be enormous. The family's bedrooms might be kept at a comfortable 65 degrees, while the servants' attic rooms hovered near freezing. Hot water was carried up endless flights of stairs, cooling with every step, so that by the time it reached a servant's wash basin, it was barely lukewarm. The servants experienced a strange hybrid existence, surrounded by luxury they could never possess, intimate with comfort they could never share. You think of the woman from the tenements, her red and cracked hands, her hours spent at the frozen water pump. If she worked here, she'd still have red and cracked hands from scrubbing floors, from wringing laundry, from the endless labour that kept these houses running. The work wouldn't be easier, but she'd be warm. She'd eat the leftovers from meals more lavish than anything she'd ever cooked for herself. Her children might find positions in the household eventually, climbing the narrow ladder of domestic service. It was a trade many made, exchanging freedom for security, autonomy for warmth. There's ongoing discussion among historians about whether the wealthy were aware of how the poor lived, whether they understood the suffering happening just blocks away from their comfortable homes. Some researchers argue that ignorance was genuine, that the rich inhabited such separate spheres that poverty was literally invisible to them. Others point to the countless reform movements led by wealthy philanthropists as evidence that many knew and cared deeply. Some people will tell you they simply didn't understand, that the comfortable classes lived in genuine ignorance of how the other half existed. Others argue they understood perfectly well but had convinced themselves this was the natural order of things, that poverty served some divine purpose they weren't meant to question. Then there are those who believe the truth was messier than either explanation, that the privileged wrestled with knowledge and guilt, building intricate mental frameworks that let them sleep soundly without dismantling the very foundations of their comfort. The music drifting from the house changes now, becoming something slower and more deliberate. A waltz, maybe. And if you look through those tall windows, you can watch the couples gliding together in perfect time. Everything about them speaks of ease, of unhurried elegance. Tonight, their greatest worries probably centre on whether the champagne has been chilled to exactly the right temperature, whether dinner will arrive at the proper moment, whether that young aristocrat will finally work up the courage to ask for someone's hand in marriage. Coal doesn't cross their minds. Frozen pumps don't register as real concerns. And certainly they're not aware of you out here in the shadows, observing their luminous world from beyond the glass. What you're feeling isn't quite anger. You're far too cold for that, too exhausted, too ground down by everything this night has thrown at you. What rises in you instead is something like amazement at how strange it is that one world can hold both this brilliant room and that other room where your journey started. Both these people wrapped in fur and silk and that family pressed together under their one thin blanket. The same city contains it all. The same winter holds both realities. The same stars look down with equal indifference on everything, and yet these are two completely separate universes, divided by nothing more substantial than money and the random circumstances of birth. A door opens at the side of the house and a servant steps out, carrying a bucket of ashes she needs to empty in the alley. Your eyes meet hers for just a second. She can't be more than 16, her face drained of colour from weariness, her hands chapped and raw in exactly the way you'd expect from someone who works in the rookeries. She looks at you without any hint of surprise. She's encountered people like you before, standing in the darkness, pulled toward light and heat they'll never be allowed to touch. Then she breaks the connection and rushes back toward the doorway, trying to get inside before the cold can work its way deep into her bones. The door shuts. The music plays on. The chandeliers continue blazing, and you turn back toward the rookeries, toward the world that makes sense to you, leaving this peculiar radiant kingdom to its fantasies of warmth that never ends. Something's different about the sky. You notice it first as a subtle shift, the darkness beginning to lose its complete and total quality, becoming something gentler, something that might eventually allow light to break through. One by one the stars are disappearing, giving up their icy brilliance to make way for morning's slow approach. It feels like you've been walking the entire night, though in dreams time doesn't move the way it should. But now, finally, the endless night is drawing to a close. You find your way back through the rookeries, following streets that have taken on a kind of familiarity despite their strangeness. The buildings present themselves differently in this early grey light, somehow less menacing, their harsh angles made softer by the gathering dawn. Frost still catches the light on every surface, but now it's lovely rather than threatening, delicate patterns that will vanish the moment the sun gains any real strength. The cold persists, but it's lost its personal edge, its sense of hostility. It's just what happens in winter now. just the season doing what seasons do. The woman's building appears before you, that tilting tenement where everything began. You climb those complaining stairs, one final time, your feet automatically finding the places worn smooth by countless others, and you push through the door into the room that has somehow, impossibly, become a sort of home. They're all still asleep. The children remain woven together on their mattress, breathing slowly and steadily, their faces calm in the strengthening light. The woman has finally given in to her exhaustion, curved around them with one arm stretched across their small forms like a shield. The man sleeps as well, his injured hands tucked under his face, his chest moving with the deep, even rhythm of genuine rest. They made it through. All of them made it through. Another night has passed and they're still here, still together, still drawing breath. Here's something that didn't need to be written down by historians because everyone who lived through those winters already carried this knowledge. Survival counted as victory all by itself. Not comfort, not wealth, not any of the grand achievements that fill the history books. Just the plain fact of waking up, of taking another breath, of opening your eyes to find the people you love still breathing next to you. The Victorians who endured these brutal winters grasped something essential about being alive. They understood that life matters not because of what you accomplish, but simply because you possess it. Because you keep going. Because you hold on despite everything trying to stop you. The fire has burned itself out entirely. Nothing remains but cold ash sitting in the grate. Yet the room isn't nearly as frozen as it was when darkness first fell. The bodies crowded into this small space have done what bodies do, creating warmth through the simple fact of being alive, heating the air with their breath and their blood. It's not comfortable by any measure we'd recognize today, but it's sufficient. It was always sufficient. Through the paper patches covering the window, you can make out the first real light of dawn reaching the rooftops. It's thin and pale, more a suggestion than a certainty, but it's unmistakably there. The sun is coming back, just as it always does. The night, regardless of how it seemed to stretch on forever, was never truly without end. Maybe there's something to learn from that. Something about holding on, about waiting patiently, about trusting that darkness always, eventually, gives way to light. The oldest girl begins to stir, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looks around the room, taking inventory of her brothers, her parents, the dead fire, the frost decorating the window. Then she notices you there in your corner, and something passes between you both. Not language, because this is a dream and dreams don't require words, but recognition. She understands you've been here with her family throughout this long night. She knows you've witnessed how they exist, how they struggle, how they persist. And what you see in her eyes isn't shame or self-pity or bitterness. What you see is a quiet sense of dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. She smiles, barely, and lets her eyes close again. A few more minutes of warmth before the day makes its demands. A few more moments of peace before the struggle starts over. She's earned this. They all have. And now the night lets you go. Slowly, gently, like fingers loosening from a grip held too long. The room begins to soften around you, its boundaries becoming unclear, its sounds fading into a pleasant hum. You've covered so much ground tonight, through frozen streets and packed tenements, through fog and darkness and winter air that cuts like a blade. You've witnessed suffering, certainly, but you've also seen strength. You've observed hardship, but also the refusal to give up. The people of the Rookeries lived lives we struggle to comprehend, and yet they lived them completely, seeking warmth wherever it existed, sharing their meagre resources, loving each other through the cold. Let yourself rest now. The journey is finished. Your body becomes heavy, settling into whatever holds you. A chair, a bed, some soft place that accepts your weight. Your breathing slows, finding the same rhythm as the sleeping family, matching the pulse of everyone who has ever searched for warmth against the cold. You are safe. You are warm. The long night has ended and morning light spreads across the world, soft and golden and filled with quiet possibility. The fire in your imagination flickers one last time, not burning anymore, just embers holding onto the memory of heat. Warmth isn't only about temperature. Warmth is connection. Warmth is understanding that others have faced darkness before you and walked into morning. Warmth is realizing you're not alone, that you've never been alone, that the human hunger for comfort and shelter and companionship reaches back through countless cold nights exactly like this one. Your eyes are growing heavier now. The frost on the window melts gradually, one drop at a time as the sun continues its patient climb. The children sleep on, dreaming whatever dreams belong to those who have known difficulty and come through it. The woman's arm tightens briefly around her family, a protective embrace that needs no conscious thought. They are together. They are safe, and so are you. Let the cold slip away from your thoughts. Let the darkness melt into warmth and light. You have journeyed through a Victorian winter, and you have come through to the other side, bringing with you the silent strength of having endured. The past is quiet now, folding itself into the gentle hush of memory, and you are welcome to rest alongside it. Sleep arrives without effort, soft and full, like snow settling over a city that has at last discovered stillness. The long night has passed. Warmth once lit never completely fades. It moves from person to person, from soul to soul, from one age to the next, a steady thread of endurance that reaches from those icy streets all the way to where you are right now, sheltered and warm and waiting for sleep. Sweet dreams. The dawn will wait.